Remember everything, the man says? Well, in a way, yes, everything. But we need to start eliminating a problem that many people have. Many people think that there's just one way to read, and many people think that there's just one way to memorize what you read. But that's simply not true. There are several ways to read, and that's because there are multiple kinds of books. And there are multiple kinds of memory techniques for the different kinds of information in those books. So if you have a toolbox of strategies at your fingertips, you'll be able to read faster, remember more, and even better. You'll understand what you're reading and become a person of knowledge and wisdom. You'll make connections on the fly and experience multiple aha moments of revelation. And so, if you want to know how to read a book and remember everything that matters in those books, like a professional scholar or a top-performing entrepreneur who operates as an architect and a builder of a life that feels exciting and vibrant each and every day. This is Dr. Anthony Metivier. Welcome you to the Magnetic Memory Method podcast from magneticmerrymethod.com, where we discuss the real tactics and strategies that work when it comes to learning faster and remembering more. Now, if you're new here and you would love a life like that, please make sure that you're subscribed, hit that thumbs up, and visit me at magneticmerrymethod.com/RWM to get notified when the next cohort of my Read with Momentum cohort program goes live. That's happening soon, and it's your chance to be part of a growing movement of readers who use the best scientific reading strategies available in combination with the ancient art of memory. Combined, you'll experience better living through better memory almost on autopilot. That's magneticmerrymethod.com/RWM. So let's talk about the four main types of reading, which you may have heard about from Mortimer J. Adler in How to Read a Book. Now, are his ideas any good? Let's have a look, shan't we? The first is what he calls elementary reading. And Adler says that this reading type hardly goes past basic understanding. So you know what words on a page say, and maybe you can follow a basic plot in a simple novel. However, I think we need to add a very, very important point to what Adler is talking about here. It's not just basic understanding. Elementary reading is also often directed reading, and that means you're told to do it by a parent or a teacher. This is the opposite of self-directed reading, and that's a big problem. As the authors of Balancing Principles for Teaching Elementary Reading argue, one core value matters above all. Not just being able to understand words on a page or follow a plot. Teachers and parents and self-directed adults should strive to make reading part of their lives as something they desire so much that they seek out how to improve their own self-directed reading behaviors. This is so important because literacy demands are only going up as technology and automation increases. You know, robots are writing books now, and that means more to read and less time to read more in. And you have to be able to think about and choose what matters to read, where your attention needs to go, and what you need to attend to in the books that you choose to read. Not only that, but you need critical thinking to do it. Critical thinking is so important to the success of all people. In fact, there are 9 critical thinking strategies that I've covered before on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast, so you might want to look for that episode. And here's another thing about elementary reading. You cannot fully develop critical thinking at all if you only have elementary reading skills. And you need that desire, that self-directed motivation to read more. And I think that Adler needs to have that added in, which we've done for him just now, right? So thanks again for being part of this and helping spread this around. Your comments and sharing really, really help. Now, the next type of reading that Adler talks about is called inspectional reading. But I think these days a lot of people use this term as skimming and scanning, something that is often mixed up in the speed reading world, which is a lot of pseudoscience. But technically there's nothing wrong with inspectional reading. There's a book called Reading as a Perceptual Process, and these authors have shown that you can skip around and even scan a book without necessarily losing comprehension. However, the interesting finding in reading as a perceptual process is that how much you're going to understand tends to be linked by how well that you handwrite. So for example, they talk about target scanning. So people who scan books, they scan books more effectively when they have good handwriting skills. Now, why might that be? Well, as you're skimming and scanning through a book, if you're well practiced watching your own handwriting, then probably your eyes have better target scanning, which helps you pick up what's going on in writing in general. So this is a kind of procedural memory. So if you never write by hand and you're finding it difficult to grasp the meaning of books that you're skimming through using these pseudoscientific speed reading techniques, you might want to improve your long handwriting instead of typing. And I talk about using a memory journal all the time and doing it by hand, and it all matches with this science. It's very, very important to understand this. And, there's a lot of people who have talked about inspectional reading not working from devices or not being able to skim and scan through ebooks, for example. In fact, I find this really difficult myself. I was even quoted recently in Yahoo News about skimming and scanning and who it tends to work for and why it tends to work for those people. And it's not just target scanning, it's not just having a lot of practice with handwriting, but it is also how much you know about the topic. So skimming and scanning or inspectional reading is generally best used by people who are already familiar with the topic that they're inspecting. This is so key. So you can get away with it if you already know the topic, but if you already know the topic, chances are you're not going to rest your laurels on this kind of reading. You're actually going to read it in detail so that you can be sure that you're not missing out on any of those fine granular details. All right, so the next thing is analytical reading. And this is a very, very interesting topic because it lets us throw out another huge problem. Just as we said that you need to master different kinds of reading and different kinds of memory techniques, you also need to master how you think about time. See, a lot of people worry that reading without understanding wastes time. And so how are you going to analyze things if you don't understand them? I disagree that you have to analyze with understanding while you read, and I disagree that you're wasting time if you read things that you don't understand. It's the opposite, and I'll just give you my own personal example. I read so that I might understand, and so do other successful readers. After all, if I already know what a book is going to cover, do I really need to bother reading it? Maybe I can figure that out with skimming and scanning, but as I just expressed, oftentimes I'm reading with even more close attention precisely because I want to make sure I don't miss out on granular details, nuances that I don't know, and that I'm never going to know if I keep skimming and scanning in an unprofessional, unscholarly way. So, to be a successful reader, you lean into what you don't understand, and that means you keep reading even when you don't understand. And you analyze what it is you think you don't understand as you go, ideally by taking notes. Now, your notes might be in the form of big ideas or main points that you find, but your notes can also be questions. Questions are excellent. You're setting the framework for highly targeted future reading that you will use to help answer your questions that come up while you're reading. This is analytical note-taking. It's not just about writing down the gems or the main points. It's about taking note of what you don't understand yet and leaving yourself breadcrumbs that will help you easily find your way back to your own questions. To do this in a way that is effective and efficient, I use a lot of index cards, and I go more into this in my free training, How to Memorize a Textbook, and more on that in a minute. Now, let's say that you have to read a book on a topic that you're already familiar with and you're getting bored. How do you deal with your boredom? I come up against this quite a bit because I do exactly what I'm suggesting. I read books, I'm familiar with the topic, it gets repetitive, and so forth. Well, you still need to perform what can also be called a close reading, and you can still get your notes going, and you can still have questions arise, such as, why is this person making that point in the way that they're making this point? And then, what else does this connect to? This can be an analytical process that brings even the most boring text to life. Now, what else is involved? Well, there's a lot, frankly, and I want to give you my favorite close reading or analytical strategies. First of all, you want to understand the book's genre or category. Now, why would this be important? Well, it will help you connect the book to other texts that directly relate to the book you're reading, and it will help you find important connections just by thinking about the genre it belongs to. So knowing the various fields of knowledge helps you speed up your pattern recognition, and classifying texts by their type is important. It's so important that I even created an entire course about this called Genre Frameworks, which is included with Read with Momentum. So if you want first dibs at a seat the next time the cohort goes live, make sure you go to magneticmerrymethod.com/RWM to register your interest. Now, another thing is composition. You want to think about, inquire into how a book is put together. This is called the form-content paradigm of composition. In other words, how a book is written formally forms part of its ultimate meaning. For example, Plato's Republic is a dialogue. This formal aspect influences the meaning of the philosophical ideas in the text. They are discursive, and they are dialectical, and they combine objective and subject reasoning through dialogue in a way that only the form of dialogue can. Aristotle's philosophy, on the other hand, is presented in direct prose. It is argumentative and designed to convince you that his points are valid. And if you want to know more about what Aristotle said about memory, you should definitely check out my video, Aristotle's Nuclear Alphabet. And that's a very exciting video because Aristotle gets into how the form of the alphabet in any language, can be used to help you have a better content memorization strategy. The next tool that you want to have in your toolbox when reading books at a highly sophisticated level is to be able to paraphrase. And that's because analyzing a text isn't just about reading, it's about being able to repeat it in your own words, to restate the points from your particular perspective. So developing in a general way as a reader involves not just reading, but also writing about what you've read. This is so critical because A+ students get their A+ grades by producing variations on the themes that they study. It's why I always gave A+ when I was a professor, and it's why I got them when I was a student. You can think of it like music. If you know a scale, you can play it forwards and backwards, but you can also perform the scale in your own style and leave out some notes sometimes, or switch key signatures to make it much more rich and varied because you're able to repeat things not just from one book, but from many books in your own words. So you practice paraphrasing, and your writing really needs to be able to make connections. So when you've properly analyzed a book, what you're also going to do is, in part of your paraphrasing, connect it to other books that you've read. This is really important. And it's one thing that I love to do, and sometimes in my index cards I will say comp so-and-so. So comp is short for comparison, and it's just absolutely fantastic. Now you might be thinking, well, okay, so how do I get started with this? I don't know any other books that I can compare one to the other in a paraphrase that I'm making by writing in my own words about what I've read. Well, you just get started. And once that you've read one book, you read another one, and then that's when you can start to compare. Even if they're unrelated, you can start to create mental links. And if you can't make mental links based on comparisons, you make it on contrasts. So you think, why is this book different? And you can write about that difference, and it will just help you become a better critical thinker about what you've read. And so paraphrasing is really important. And if you're still worried that you might not be able to write a sentence at all, then a book that I recommend is called How to Write a Sentence and How to Read One by Stanley Fish. You won't regret going through that book. Now, the next type of reading that Adler has for you is called syntopical reading. Now, this term sounds fancier than it is. It basically means reading a number of books on the same topic. Then, of course, ideally by paraphrasing with handwriting your own summaries, you can compare the output of the different books in the same topic. Not only that, but you can abstract the core ideas through contrasting different approaches to them. So you're going to be able to summarize comparisons and paraphrase those comparisons, but also describe where they're different. I do this frequently here on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast by comparing and contrasting different Memory Palace books. I will say, Hugh of St. Victor talks about using the arc. Well, that compares to using a memory wheel, or it is contrastatively different from using a memory wheel, and I can go into detail about what that is, and I am doing it by paraphrasing. I'm not reproducing the entire books, but I'm comparing and contrasting by having done this syntopical reading of many books on the Mary Palace techniques. So what exactly you should compare between the books that you're reading? Well, you can think about things like publication dates. The difference between the 12th century and the 17th century, for example, are huge, right? The author backgrounds. The author background between, let's say, Robert Flood and Giordano Bruno. They're going to be different, even though they're not that different in time. Bruno is going to be much more different than, say, Hugh of St. Victor, because you're looking at the difference between the 12th century and the 16th century. Now, you can also look at differences like why books were written. The reason why someone like Harry Lorraine is writing a memory book is, in many ways, very, very different than why Giordano Bruno is writing a memory book. Then you can look at their research approaches, the resources that they're referring to. I don't remember Harry Lorraine referring to Aristotle in any depth, but Bruno certainly does in many of his books, right? And then different people have different politics. They have agendas. They have all kinds of different things that they do. They might cite different kinds of books, key passages, or they might cite the same passages but interpret them differently. And then they may have vocabulary that they use that's very unique to them, that they're using to try to put a spin on what it is that they're talking about. So these are very, very important things that you can look for, and you can only see the different patterns, the different comparisons, the different contrasts when you're reading multiple books on the same topic. And, you can also think about distinguishing fact from opinion. So when comparing different authors on similar topics, you'll find that some stick to the science and evidence in their research, and others will waffle on about ideas without providing substantial references, or others won't be waffling at all, but they're using mental tools and critical thinking to speculate, and ideally they will have a little flag that says, hey, I'm just speculating here, but this is the way that I think when I allow myself to philosophize on this topic, and I'm not pretending to do science here, and so forth. And that is just very, very powerful for you to notice that, think about it, and then compare and contrast it within a topic. And as the reader, you don't ever want to discount opinion or even anecdotal evidence, right? You need to place it in the context of the writers, in their historical period, based on the research resources that they're using. And you can find entire anecdotal books that seem outlandish on the surface, but actually in the future do get backed up by science, even if the author was unaware of the science at the time. This is like Buddhism 101. All right, those are Adler's tips. Would you like some more? I've got 6 tips of my own to add. Now, some of what Adler's saying is solid. I've already amped up the idea of elementary reading by suggesting that you also make part of your elementary reading training, as if you maybe train a dog to like certain animals like ducks. If you're training a duck hunting dog, you train yourself to like reading. I want you to make that part of the elementary level. And Adler, he lived at a different time than we live in. The very definition, since he wrote about how to read a book, it has changed. So when Adler wrote in the 40s and updated it in the 70s, contacting an author would basically involve contacting the publisher first. These days, you can follow authors on Twitter. You can watch countless interviews with them. You can often even get an email response to your questions, if not a response, on Twitter or in the comments under a video. So our era is different, and with our era in mind, I want to go through some additional tips, and I hope you'll find them empowering. And one of them that I don't remember Adler talking about in any depth is just to schedule your reading time, and that's all the more important because you can use Twitter and YouTube and so forth to interact more with the authors. And sometimes people mistake listening to interviews, listening to long-form discussions as being the equivalent of sitting down with a book and starting to read. It's different. So you want to actually schedule your reading time. And the importance of scheduling is so important. There are many ways to do it, but the easiest I find is just to follow a set of simple rules. So when I'm not doing major research projects, I try to get in an hour of reading in the morning and an hour of reading at night. And if I can squeeze in more reading during the afternoon, I certainly will. I usually do some form of digital fasting. So I leave the device at home, the phone stays on my desk, and I take a book, we go out for a walk, and I just read, and it's beautiful. In the past, when I really needed to get a lot of discipline, I used to track my exact activities, which I found a lot more useful than doing to-do lists. These are more like descriptive lists as opposed to prescriptive lists. So I wasn't writing down what I needed to do, but rather I was tracking what it was that I did. And then that would help me notice, hey, you just spent 2 hours on Twitter. Do you really want to be doing that? And then I would correct. And sometimes I'm doing research on Twitter right now for a book. There's going to be a chapter on Twitter and the time suck that it is and some of the benefits that are there. But I still try and schedule it in. And even this video we're making now is a form of following the plan, following the schedule. So if one thing is common to us all, it's that having some kind of rule will set you free. Without a rule, you become a prisoner of chance and inconsistency. And this is all the more important since Adler wrote How to Read a Book. Now, another thing is to pace your reading. So now when I do research, I like to pace my reading and work in 90-day blocks. So for example, when I started studying Advaita Vedanta, I made it a rule to read only about this topic for 90 days. Now, it's not the only thing that I read, but I really, really focused on it, and I tried to triangulate it with readings that related to it so that I could build up a foundation. Now, I wound up reading about it and writing about it for longer than 90 days, but this only proves the power of setting rules. They are productive of more. So the more you focus on one thing, the more you're going to likely get out of it. And anything less than 90 days is unlikely to help your brain build enough connections to compare and contrast anything of substance. And it's unlikely to give you enough of your own handwriting in the form of summaries to also allow you to be able to compare and contrast substantively. So this is a science-based principle. And it's the origin of what I now call Metivier's razor. Yes, my ego is big enough that I named a saying after myself. Metivier's razor. It is this. Less than 90 days of study and practice of almost anything, including any accelerated learning technique, does not deserve the phrase, I tried. So, if you want to try this for yourself and do it for 90 days, pick ideally 10 to 15 books that deal with one topic for syntopical reading, and then for the next 90 days, plow through those books. For bonus points, follow up with another 90 days on a related topic. So for example, I followed my Advaita Vedanta research project with 90 days on Hermeticism, then 90 days on Zen. This allowed me to not only compare multiple books within each topic area, I was also able to compare and contrast the topic areas as a whole. And then, when I'm reading certain things in Bruno, where in Latin he's saying things like habit ergo chaos non figurum non statuum. I think actually it's non statuem non figurum. My Latin pronunciation is not quite there yet, but nonetheless, I get it, and I get the kind of Zen emphasis or the connection to Zen, or at least I'm making an educated guess because I spent the time on Zen and Hermeticism and Advaita Vedanta. So those are blocks of 90 days study with very, very, very syntopical focus on just books in a particular category as much as possible. And yes, I read some Michael Connelly novels at the same time for topic exhaustion relief. Give this style a try, especially if you want to effectively create your own university for yourself. Because that's what we're doing. We're making it like a semester for ourselves, and this is what a course of graduate study at university would be like, about 90 days on a topic. Right now, I'm doing it with Shakespeare, and it is so great. It feels so good to be developing this deep network in my head that understands Shakespeare, what Harold Bloom has to say about Shakespeare, etc., what all kinds of people I've never heard about on YouTube are saying about Shakespeare, and that focus, Shakespeare, 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 is giving me yet another perspective on Giordano Bruno, for example, because some people think that Hamlet was deeply inspired by the character of Bruno, and some people think that Shakespeare may have known Bruno. And I'll only know or be able to speculate, knowing that it's a speculation, a lot better if I myself have read all of Shakespeare that I possibly can to help connect those dots. And you know what? Being able to recite Shakespeare from memory is a lot of fun too. Oh, you want me to prove that I memorized some Shakespeare? No problem. Oh, for a muse of fire that could ascend the brightest heaven of invention, a kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold our swelling scene. Isn't that cool? I like that. And it's another thing that you'll want to do is to memorize at least some of what you're studying. I'm not going to memorize all of King Henry V. I'm not even going to memorize the whole of the chorus's opening soliloquy. But just having that little bit in memory, it connects me so deeply to the material. And if you've spent any time with me on any of my YouTube channels and the podcast and all that stuff, I can recite lots of stuff from memory because I've memorized it, and it's a huge part of being able to compare and contrast lots of things. And when I say everything, it isn't everything that you need to memorize, but if you start to develop this foundational knowledge, other things will start to naturally connect, and you get a triangulation, almost like a holographic effect, where you know that you don't necessarily know it all, but you know where to look, and that holograph leaps up in your mind, and you find those other things that you're looking for. And then if you gradually and progressively memorize more and more and more, oh well, it's just the most amazing thing that's going to happen to you. All right? So this is how it works. You get that illusion, that holographic feeling of more being more, because it is legitimately the path to more. Okay, so the next tip I have for you is to interleave your reading. Now, I rarely read books from beginning to end without some kind of pause. The exception would be novels, where I will sometimes just stick with a novel and I'll be like, man, this is the most amazing novel, and I'll just keep reading and reading and reading and reading, right? But when it comes to reading nonfiction, there's a very powerful strategy called interleaving. So you can learn faster and remember more by reading about 3 to 5 books, not at the same time, but pretty much at the same time. And to interleave, you keep shifting between the books. And there's no exact pattern you need to follow. You know, you might find some of the scientific articles on interleaving that they say text A and then weave in text B and then text C and so forth. And, you know, I don't get all that super hyper strategic about it, but I'll read between 1 to 3 chapters of a book, and then I'll switch to the next. And then I'll read 1 to 3 chapters of that, and then to the next. And the books that are being interleaved are read until they are done, but this is a very, very powerful technique. It actually works, and you should give it a try. It's a lot of really, really powerful stuff that gets into diffuse thinking, is one of the scientific terms that they use, and you can look more into that term if you're studying memory yourself. Diffuse thinking is just a wonderful thing. It's kind of like percolation. You put stress on, and you're really focused on something, and then your brain actually does the processing when you take the focus off. But that doesn't mean you have to stop reading to get the benefit. You just switch books. Now the next step is to capture and then organize what you're reading. Now, I don't know about you, but when I come across ideas that resonate, I want to remember them. And we want to have a process that is separate in order to read books better. And here I'm talking mostly about nonfiction. I can't really see a use case of what we're going to talk about now for fiction, but there might be one, just not necessarily for me. But what we want to do is separate the processes. So we want to separate the extraction process from the memorization process. So what we want to do is read and take notes while we're reading, get those notes onto index cards, and then once the notes are on our index cards, then memorize those. Now let's say that you have some information extracted. How do you know what to remember? What's important? Well, generally I suggest memorizing author names, historical dates, key ideas, key vocabulary, and verbatim passages every so often. Now, you might not think that those are the most important details that you could be focusing on, but just start somewhere. And being able to remember the names and historical dates of people is incredibly useful because it helps with comparison and contrast, and it gives you a greater historical sense of who was alive in the 12th century, who was alive in the 16th century, etc. And that is going to really help build a landscape in your mind of time, location, and a who's who list of the important people Then once you've established memorizing that, especially if you're using a memory palace and you're using those individuals, maybe paintings you've seen of those individuals in your memory palaces, then you're going to have figures that you can layer information onto using the art of memory. It's very, very beautiful. I'm glad I did all of these things, especially during my university years. During my dissertation defense, just to take one example, one of my examiners said, "You've hardly read anything or talked about Nietzsche in this document at all." And I just pushed the document forward and said, page 72, and then I recited Nietzsche from memory in German. And this was just an amazing thing. And needless to say, I walked out of that room with my PhD in hand. I wasn't toppled over. And I memorized both the page number and the quote in the foreign language, and I just used a memory palace. Learn this technique. Make sure that you visit magneticmerrymethod.com, go through the free course so that you know what a proper, well-formed memory palace is, and start to use principles like magnetic imagery and the bridging figure so that you can have someone like Hugh of St. Victor or Giordano Bruno or Nietzsche in your head and place these figures like chess pieces on a board in a room that you're familiar with, move them around so that they can help you remember key terms, historical dates, puzzling concepts, on and on and on. I mean, I remember learning about diallotism and paraconsistency. Each and every one of those words I would have forgotten if I hadn't attached them to specific images that were already in my head. That's what the magnetic memory method is all about. The more you read, the more you memorize, the more you'll develop an intuition for what's important, what the key points are. And if you practice extracting information, culling out the most important points, memorizing it, you're going to hone your radar for the points that matter. And when it comes to doing more research and finding this process, you've sometimes just got to take different paths. Instead of doing research on the internet, sometimes you have to go to the library. Talk to the librarian. I used to visit the department secretary and ask for exams from the previous years, and often they'll have example exams. This is dedicated research that can help you figure out what's going to be important on a test. And then you use that pre-knowledge to figure out what you're going to research more and what you're going to focus on in greater specificity because you've seen some of the questions. You've seen the key terms, the key ideas in those questions. Then you go and look deeper. Here's another thing that, this is going to help you read so much. If your professors have written books, read those books. Find out which books your professors read. There's bibliographies in the back of those books, and that's going to help. And the textbooks that they assign, they often have feature boxes, they have summaries, they have introductions, they have conclusions, they have bullet points. All that stuff is there for a reason. But those bibliographies are key. The books that other books cite, they are loaded with so much foundational knowledge. Extract from them, memorize from them, and if you memorize something that turns out to not be important, no big deal. You never know when it might be useful in the future. And if it's never useful, you've at least gotten in some practical practice using memory techniques. So the next step is to constantly keep on expanding more of what you have already read. Revisit and amplify. So I like to try to reread at least one book per month and then amplify with more books in topics that I've already read as much as possible. So you could think of it as like a 2% rule. When I'm in one of my 90-day reading blocks, I build it out by trying to read 2 to 10% of the books mentioned in the core book that I'm reading. Now, if a book has too many references to allow 2% to make sense, I'll just pull that number down to, say, 2 other books. And, you just don't have to be super strict about it. It doesn't have to be other books. You could just read 2% of the articles. Articles tend to be shorter. And you're getting these references from trusted sources. Those people have managed to get a book done, and you're getting the material that they used to write their books. So you can already be certain that it was valuable enough to cite. So that background reading is going to probably be pretty valuable. And if it isn't, again, so what? You've gotten practice at being a reader, being someone who studies. One secret of well-educated people that a lot of people don't seem to understand is that we tend to spend a lot of time reading nonsense, stuff that leads nowhere, stuff that is about things that are no good. For example, I have read and written about the Mandela effect. I had to read a lot about it to understand it, and in order to debunk it, I had to read many pseudoscientific articles, but also articles about science and articles about debunking. And I point this out because your reading strategy may take you into questionable realms, but as long as you're training yourself in critical thinking, you're training yourself to be skeptical in a healthy and positive way, it's okay to read all that stuff. It will give you even more benefits because you have the compare and contrast, and you're going to be able to spot pseudoscientific nonsense even faster and with greater depth in the future. And you know what? You're going to have the ability to not necessarily dismiss things as quickly as you might, or at least give them a fair shot using the best possible tools for giving things a fair shot, right? So these strategic things are very, very important. And you can also have the charity to look at the author's context, which is going to grow your mental web of connections, even if you wind up dismissing certain authors as not having very important ideas. All right? So this is just part of the game. Reading and reading more is a puzzle, and it's a puzzle that includes pieces that don't necessarily fit into a complete picture. Not all of the pieces have to fit. That's not the way knowledge works. Knowledge is a thing that's coming into being, and it comes into being as you interact with it. So the most important thing is to have a strategy for expanding your knowledge, expanding the borders of the puzzle so you have room for more pieces and you can keep track of the pieces that don't fit. Very, very powerful. Now, this should go without saying, but after you've identified the 2 to 10% that you're going to read next, schedule the time to actually get that reading done. If you're going to have more books that you reread on a schedule, then of course, schedule your rereading time. I'm going through Shakespeare now, and I'm rereading a lot of plays I've already read before. It just needs to be scheduled. Sometimes I take a little break, a couple of days off, maybe a week off Shakespeare to give my head a bit of a rest as I go through some of the texts that are adjacent to Shakespeare, commentaries on Shakespeare, etc. But it's still scheduled and it gets done. Now, if you want more help along these lines, make sure to go to magneticmerrymethod.com/RWM so you're first to be notified when the next live cohort takes place. Okay, so it might seem like there's a lot of moving parts to what I've said today, especially if you're new to reading in the sophisticated manner that we've talked about, but I've already given you the clue to how to make it second nature. Give it 90 days, and I'm confident you'll see the logic in everything we've just discussed. You're going to become a reading pro so that you can reach expertise, not just in one topic, but ideally multiple topics. Frankly, I can't imagine how horrible my life would be now if I hadn't started reading this way a long time ago. And as a professional researcher and writer today, I can't stress the importance of reading highly enough for becoming the architect of your dreams. The future you long for is literally waiting for you on the pages of books that you're going to want to read faster and be able to remember. But even as fast as you possibly can go, what does it matter if you're going in the wrong direction? Use the books you're already reading to help you find that direction. And so let me know, what would you like to read about with all of these tips in mind over the next 90 days? And take this tip with you. Sit down. Read a book. They write them from beginning to end for a reason. And understanding never comes any faster by stopping. But understanding is guaranteed to come when you keep reading, ideally reading with momentum, strategies that make it addictive to keep reading, and then reading some more, then rereading. Thanks again for being with me for another episode of the Magnetic Mary Method podcast. And be sure to search for and find the full video I have for you on how to memorize a textbook. You're going to love how this simple technique helps make sure that you focus only on the best parts of the books you want to read, and that way you have everything you need. Thanks again, and until we have a chance to speak again, keep yourself magnetic.